Why did the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans change so much over time? At first, the French, Dutch, British, and Spanish came to the Americas looking for land, wealth, and resources. But they didn't come alone. They needed help from the American Indians, who knew the land and had valuable trade goods. For example, the French settlers in Canada built strong trade relationships with the Huron people. They exchanged French goods like guns, metal tools, and cloth for beaver pelts, which were highly prized in Europe. Similarly, the Dutch, particularly in New Netherland, modern-day New York, formed alliances with the Mohawk tribe, the most powerful group within the Iroquois Confederacy. These alliances were based on the fur trade, with the Dutch providing firearms and other European goods to the Mohawk in return for furs. These early partnerships laid the foundation for European footholds in North America, but they also planted the seeds of future conflict over land and control of resources. As the demand for land grew, these peaceful relationships began to unravel. By the 1670s, British settlers in New England, hungry for more territory, increasingly encroached on native lands, particularly those of the Wampanoag tribe. Led by Chief Metacom, also known as King Philip, the Wampanoag saw no choice but to resist. The tensions culminated in Metacom's War, King Philip's War, from 1675 to 1678. Native forces attacked over half of New England's towns, but the war ended in a decisive defeat for Metacom and his allies. The British seized more native land, expanding their settlements across New England. This was a turning point in British-Native relations, as the balance of power shifted dramatically in favor of the British, setting a pattern of domination that would continue for decades. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, the Spanish faced their own challenges. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, led by Pope, was one of the most significant native uprisings. After years of Spanish efforts to convert the Pueblo people and force them into labor, the Pueblos united and successfully expelled the Spanish from New Mexico for over a decade. When the Spanish eventually returned, they were forced to compromise, allowing the Pueblos to keep some of their cultural and religious practices. This revolt illustrates how native resistance could sometimes force European powers to adapt, rather than simply impose their will. Geographic differences also played a major role in shaping these relationships. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy aligned with the British during the Beaver Wars of the mid-1600s, a series of conflicts over control of the fur trade. The Iroquois, armed with British firearms, expanded their territory by defeating rival tribes like the Huron, who were allied with the French. These wars gave the Iroquois considerable power in the region, but they also deepened divisions between tribes and Europeans. By contrast, in the Great Plains, the introduction of horses by the Spanish transformed the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes. Once largely sedentary farmers, they became mobile buffalo hunters, allowing them to expand their territory and dominate the plains. In the Southeast, tribes like the Cherokee traded deer skins with the British, gaining firearms and tools in return. However, this trade also made them more dependent on European goods, weakening their bargaining position as British demands for land increased. These changing alliances reflected deeper shifts in power, often driven by European conflicts. For example, after the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the French lost much of their territory in North America. This weakened their native allies, such as the Huron and Algonquin, who had long relied on French military and trade support. In contrast, the Iroquois, who had supported the British, initially gained strength from the British victory. But as British settlers moved westward, Iroquois influence diminished, as they could no longer control or limit the British presence in their lands. This shows the clear cause and effect of European wars on native alliances. Shifts in European power directly affected native fortunes. Economically, Native Americans were increasingly drawn into European trade networks, but this often came at a cost. The Ottawa, led by Chief Pontiac, relied on British goods after the French were defeated in the French and Indian War. When the British restricted trade and reduced the flow of gifts to the tribes, tensions escalated, leading to Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. Pontiac united various tribes in a coordinated effort to drive the British out of the Great Lakes region, attacking forts and settlements. Although the rebellion ultimately failed, it forced the British to reconsider their policies, resulting in the Proclamation of 1763, which was meant to limit colonial expansion into native lands. However, British settlers largely ignored the proclamation, continuing their westward push, leading to further conflicts with native groups. Environmental changes also played a crucial role. In the Northeast, the beaver population was decimated by the fur trade, which not only disrupted native economies, but also altered the local ecosystems. The Iroquois, who had once depended on beaver for both trade and sustenance, had to adapt to new economic realities as the beaver disappeared from their lands. In the Great Plains, European farming methods and the introduction of livestock, particularly cattle, transformed the landscape. Buffalo herds, which were central to the lifestyle of the Plains tribes like the Lakota, were driven westward as settlers fenced off land and plowed fields for crops. These environmental changes, brought about by European settlement and trade, forced native groups to adapt in order to survive. Diseases introduced by Europeans had an equally devastating effect. For example, the Cherokee lost up to 50% of their population to smallpox and other European diseases by the mid 1700s. This demographic collapse weakened their ability to resist British encroachment and left them vulnerable to further land seizures. The spread of disease, more than warfare, was often the most significant factor in the decline of native populations, fundamentally altering the power dynamics between native groups and European settlers. Over time, European attitudes towards Native Americans evolved as well. Initially, British settlers in Virginia depended on the Powhatan Confederacy for food and assistance, especially in the early 1600s. However, once John Rolfe introduced tobacco as a lucrative cash crop, the British demand for land skyrocketed. By the Second Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644, the British no longer saw the Powhatan as useful allies, but as obstacles to their expansion. The war ended with the near destruction of the Powhatan Confederacy and further cemented British dominance in Virginia. This shift from partnership to conflict became a common pattern as European settlers increasingly viewed native lands as their own to claim. Native groups, however, were not passive in these changes. The Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, played European powers against each other, securing firearms and trade benefits from the British while maintaining their own political autonomy. Similarly, the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes in the southeast frequently shifted alliances between the British and the French, depending on which side offered better trade terms. This diplomacy allowed some native groups to maintain power and resist European domination for longer periods. Religion also played a significant role in shaping interactions. The Spanish, led by missionaries like Father Junipero Serra, sought to convert native groups in California, such as the Chumash, through the mission system. Native Californians were forced into labor, adopting European agricultural practices and Christianity. However, this religious imposition led to resistance, including the Chumash Revolt of 1824, where the Chumash rose up against the Spanish missionaries. While the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it demonstrated the depth of native opposition to European cultural domination. Throughout these changes, Native American leaders played critical roles in guiding their people through increasingly difficult times. Chief Metacom led the Wampanoag in their fight against British expansion during Metacom's war, while Chief Pontiac united multiple tribes to resist British rule during Pontiac's Rebellion. These leaders fought to preserve their people's lands and cultures, even as European settlers pressed further into native territories. These relationships between Europeans and Native Americans changed dramatically due to economic pressures, shifting alliances, and ongoing European expansion. The Proclamation of 1763, designed to protect native lands, was a direct response to conflicts like Pontiac's Rebellion, but it ultimately failed to stop British settlers from encroaching on native territories. In the end, these changes weren't just about Europeans overpowering Native Americans. Native groups like the Iroquois and Cherokee adapted, strategized, and resisted in ways that influenced the course of history. The decisions made by both Europeans and Native Americans were driven by a desire for survival, power, and opportunity. The story of European and Native American interactions is one of cooperation, conflict, and adaptation. Both sides actively shaped these relationships and balanced power, land, and resources as they fought to secure their futures.